I'm Lowkey, a hip hop artist, political campaigner, and historian. And for me, believe that hip hop is the greatest equalizer in artistic terms that we have. It allows the poorest person to speak to the richest person. It allows people to reach beyond isolation in major ways, and it gives us real space to articulate a lot of things that afflict us in our society today.
This is Radio Freedom.
If you don't stand up for something, you'll fall for anything.
Come on! Listen!
Planet Earth, planet rap. Planet Earth, planet rap. Planet Earth, planet rap. The only segment, show, and station in the hip-hop world playing the hip-hop world. In the hip-hop world playing the hip-hop world. With Miko and I'm
Welcome to PEPR, Planet Earth, Planet Rap Virtual World Tour Conversation Series. My name is Amkelo Mbekeni Kapanen.
Yes, and my name is Mikko. Really good to have you with us. I know there's a tons of stuff online everywhere that you could be listening to, watching or reading and all that stuff, and you're here now listening to us, and this is really great. It doesn't escape us how cool it is that you are listening to this thing at the moment.
Indeed. So we've been having this conversation with these artists from all over the world, and it's been a wonderful time getting to know the person behind the persona, and in this particular series we're trying to get some insight into some of the work that we've been playing on PEPR, so it's a grand opportunity.
I was really thinking about it this week. This is like an online course, if you want to look at it that way. Like if you wanted to have like a one term for online course of the world of hip hop, what are the different factors, what are the different influences, all this different stuff, you can get to know from these interviews. I think there's a lot of very interesting things about culture and industry and art and identity.
Yes, and we've had opportunities to speak to so many different people from all over the world: South Africa, Brazil, Malaysia,
Singapore, Canada.
Yes, and now
Zimbabwe, Lisbon, Portugal.
And now our next guest is from the UK. Yes,
absolutely. He is from the UK, from London, UK, and also he's representing IraQ. He is Lowkey. Great artist, like really a great artist who's also become an interesting and important political commentator, a journalist, all sorts. He's doing it all.
Absolutely. We've been playing Lowkey since the early noughties, I think. In fact, you know what? We've known of his work since the early noughties, and we've been playing his work since the beginning of PEPR, Planet Earth, Planet Rap. So it's such a joy to be able to finally sit down with him and communicate and converse and catch up on what has been happening in his life. Some of these artists, or most of the artists, they go through so many different changes, right?
And they grow because what we've been doing this show for 11 years. I mean, imagine 11 years even in our life. We were different people when we started this, but let alone artists who's expressing in their feelings and talking about their lives, talking about what's happening. It's a very different thing that is happening when you are like 25 to when you are 36. There's a huge gap there, or like a lot of stuff happens.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and it will be very interesting for you to hear what these artists themselves have to say and what Lowkey has to say.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoyed this episode. For us, it was a real great privilege to have Lowkey here, and as it has been with all these interviews. I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the support.
Yes, yes, because oftentimes, right, we know the art, we know the work, we know the work speaks for itself, and people are interacting with the work, they grow with it, but we never really get to know the artists themselves, because not often do we get the opportunity to speak to you guys. So here we thought to ourselves, well, like PEPR is also like mostly about the artist and the music and the work, and less about us. So we're like, maybe it would be nice also to get a moment to talk to the artists themselves, because we've been playing your work forever, and so finally it would be nice to bring out, like reveal you almost and unveil it.
It's an honor, honestly. It really is. Thank you so much for the support.
I remember, well, we were just thinking, what I don't remember is the year, but I remember I used to live in Birmingham in UK, and there was a magazine, Undercover, which had a Undercover Cuts CD, that was a CD time still, and there was your song, Let Me Live, on one of those
Wow.
mixed compilations, and I don't remember the year precisely, but that was the time when I was introduced to your music, and then I bought the Key to the Game 3, and later on there was the reissue of the 2 as well. I don't know if the first one was ever available. I think
I think we've got these, right? Like these little artifacts.
Amazing, man, amazing. Yeah, it's so long ago now. It just feels like a different lifetime.
You were very young at the time. Like
I was.
Yeah, so you've been doing hip hop for incredibly long, like almost all of your life, essentially.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that at that age, I kind of jumped into it through the open mics. I used to go to school and rap. I used to call in to DJ 279's Friday Night Flavors show on Choice FM. They had something called the 60-second, either 60 seconds of fame, I think it was, or something like that. And you call up and rap for 60 seconds.
On the phone.
If you win 4 weeks in a row, then you get invited into the studio to rap live. And I won 3 weeks in a row. This is when I was 16. I won 3 weeks in a row, but then on the 4th week I lost. But then when I was 17, I was able to go in and do the Knights of the Round Table, which is where it's so different to now. You'd go in and rap around a table for at least an hour. So you're talking about, you'd have to have in your head at least 20 minutes of lyrics, 25 minutes of lyrics, which is like, if you think in terms of songs,
that's at least an EP, like
easily, yeah. And sometimes you'd freestyle a little bit and sort of react to some of the lyrics that someone had dropped. And then, when I was 17, I was able to go up there with Swiss from So Solid, and it was quite the interaction between us. And he was a great supporter, and really it was a great loss actually that Choice FM ended up getting shut down, because Global, who own a lot of the radio stations here, they shut it down, and Choice FM as a radio station was founded following the London riots in the 80s, because the British government, as one of its concessions to the black community, said we will now have a quota of what will play on FM of a genre like soca, for example, a genre like gospel, revival, soul, reggae, R&B, hip hop. And so Choice FM was part of that concession. But then obviously when it was bought by Global Media, they then, not long after it, basically shut it down and founded in its place something called Capital Extra, which is really a generally not a great station in my opinion. Whereas Choice FM was such a formative part of my upbringing, and really was part of me falling in love with hip hop. That was an amazing time, and those 3 mixtapes were released within about a year and a half. So I was working a lot between 17, 18, going to the open mic, battling people, battled for the name, for example, first time I went to the open mic. And and then things just change, now in terms of when people are developing their craft, they don't have that same kind of space to develop it in that tried and tested sort of manner, where you're in a room full of MCs and everyone wants the mic and you have to sort of prove yourself against these MCs. It was great. Yeah, it was lovely, beautiful experience. I imagine you didn't get the chance to go to Deal Real though, did you? Or did you?
I didn't.
Right. Yeah. It was a piece of history, honestly. It was such a piece of history.
I have heard about it since, but I never had that first-hand experience. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was literally like the size of this room, but like whenever people from the US would come, so from Kanye West to Mos Def to Cannabis to Jizza to Dame Dash, they'd come to the store. That and people would be having ciphers outside. it was such a beautiful culture. But we don't, it's not here anymore. They lost I think the license in 2005 it was. They might be an interesting, the Deal Real legacy team, they might be interesting people to talk to, but I don't know the ins and outs of how and why it shut down, but yeah, it shut down and was a great loss to so many people.
I guess one of the differences also for that time, besides, well, everything else, is that because it was all in CD format, I mean, I guess MySpace was kind of coming, or it was just sort of entered, but it wasn't yet we weren't really entered in that MP3 space. So you were also one of those people who were selling those mixtapes on the streets of London. I remember seeing like some video a long time ago when you're rapping somewhere to some prospective buyers of CDs, and I remember buying mixtapes like this from other people, not from you, but from other artists. So basically, you just sort of like, you were in London or maybe elsewhere as well, and sold the CDs from the back.
Well, so what we used to do was we would get the CDs, go to the open mic. I sold them in my school. I sold them in the barbershop local to me. I would go and rap at the open mic and then come out and sell them afterwards. And yeah, there was Hip Hop Connection, the magazine at that time, which you may remember.
Yeah.
To get a review in Hip Hop Connection was like brilliant, and I think my ones got 4 out of 5 or something like that. They got good ratings generally, and it meant the world to me. And Hip Hop Connection was again a big part of it. It's funny how these things just disappeared really overnight. There was such a big part of my life and my sort of relationship, and had such an intimate bond with me in terms of hip hop. And Hip Hop Connection it cultivated a different type of knowledge of the art and the music. It wasn't just about what it sounded like. It was about a lot of stuff around it, the personal lives, the reading for deeper meaning into the lyrics. And yeah, these things just disappeared sort of one by one, but pretty quickly. And then we went into the MySpace era, which was, when you were trying to get as many listens as you could sort of per day on your page. And really the next sort of stage where things sort of developed through MySpace was, 2008, I had the the sort of quote unquote super group with some of the members of Arctic Monkeys, some of the members of Baby Shambles, some of the members of Reverend and the Makers. But it was quite a kind of a different kind of project that a lot of people in the hip hop world would not really be tuned into or familiar with, because these were indie bands. And so it put us more into the sort of NME space. But then the MySpace started to kind of develop a listenership, particularly in 2009, ironically, with the Long Live Palestine song, performing it at demonstrations, performed it at a demonstration in front of a few 100,000 people. And then I saw at that time, it was really insane, 15,000 listens a day on the song, just on the MySpace, like for the next week or something. So I was like, wow, okay, something big is happening with this song. And and then Facebook was great. And, again, Facebook kind of changed in terms of, for me, in terms of use in about 2016, 2017, because it became a lot harder to reach people, even though you have this fan page that you've built up. It's just like there's a glass ceiling. You're no longer being able to reach people in the way you were. But from sort of 2009 to 2012, when I stopped for a bit, Facebook was brilliant. Facebook was directly connecting people to whatever you were posting, whenever you were posting it. So you know how it is, man. It's ups and downs.
Yes.
Yeah, it is like that. The algorithms are also and they're not our friends either. So it's very difficult to kind of get through that system.
Yeah, I was going to say that, for me, when I came to know you, when you came into my awareness, it was through Mick when I met him, I think in 2005, in 2005 in South Africa. I'm from South Africa, Cape Town. And back then, he introduced me to your album, I think, Dear Listener.
Yeah, that was a little bit later. That was a few years later.
2008, And for me, that was the first time I actually heard your work. And I thought to myself, I'm listening to Dear Listener, and it says, I'm paraphrasing, forgive if I, I misquote, but it says, when I die, I want my fans to know that they all knew me. And I thought, whoa, such a high level of vulnerability and so much honesty and so much openness. And that was before the Brene Browns of this world started giving TED Talks about the importance of vulnerability. But for you, where does that vulnerability stem from? And how did you manage to allow yourself to become so open and so vulnerable and to share so much of your story? Because story is so important.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great and interesting question. I think part of it is having, one of my parents quite good at expressing themselves emotionally. Not that the other parent is not great at it, but I think it's something that doesn't come so naturally to them because of their own upbringing. But I think particularly when my brother died in 2004, I at first, so for the first couple of days, didn't think of making songs about it, but writing the song about it was such a good experience for helping me calm down, because one of the things about us, people that have experienced some sort of trauma in childhood, physically, the way their brain differs from others is that the serotonin production is impeded somewhat. And so serotonin is vital for the regulation of panic and anxiety and fear. And that's, that's not me saying that, that is physically proven that serotonin production can be impeded due to traumatic experiences. Now, for me, it's like the writing of that song, particularly the particular song about my brother, was sort of like serving the same kind of purpose as serotonin would, because I was able to sort of, unload this stuff and feel just a little bit less anxious really about everything that had happened. So that then, I guess, lends itself to the sort of importance of emotional expression. And that was quite a sort of pivotal and important time in my life. However, I do feel that it's not always the best thing to do, to be that vulnerable and that open, because sometimes you can say things which later on, you don't feel like that 10 years later. You don't know necessarily how much that openness or that honesty will necessarily affect sort of other people close to you. They may not want that information out in the world. So, as you get older, you sort of become a little bit, possibly at that period of my life, I may have overshared actually some stuff. And really, Dear Listener was kind of the beginning of a move towards being less personal, less open, less vulnerable in terms of that side of things, because, at the same time, you are throwing things out into a place where people won't necessarily be as gentle with your scars as you hope they would be. And so bearing them seems to me now at an older age, not always the smartest course of action, but at that young age, it seemed really a no-brainer, to share, because I thought, what else is the music for if it's not for sort of sharing,
And
how
also
I feel.
it forges connections, deeper connections to your listeners. That's what I thought it achieved, So I think even though there's a downside to oversharing or being too vulnerable, as you've just said, there's also something good to be said about it, because I think it sort of like allows the listener to also allow themselves to look at their own vulnerabilities and their own psychological scars and their own trauma. Because, I mean, we all need each other to reflect each other, to be reflections to each other. So for me, I really thought that at that time it really served the purpose, and wow. I was delighted to actually be introduced to that work at that time. And of course, everything evolves. You evolve. We all evolve. But then I thought to myself, I wonder, okay, so if you want your fans to feel like they know you, and you don't remain the same person because identity, who you are, changes, that means your listeners have to change with you. What is your relationship with your fan base? And do you have to reintroduce yourself every time you change? How does it work?
Wow. Great question. Again, I think that for me, the best part of doing what I've been fortunate enough to do because of circumstance, before the internet, with the negatives of the sort of algorithmic side, the ability of big business, especially now, to sort of reproduce its own wave and pattern of making money algorithmically now. The internet, aside from that, the internet has given us an amazing way of communicating with people in a really close way. Now, for me, the best part of that is going on tour and doing meet and greets after the show and selling CDs and seeing people. And I've always found it really interesting the significance that music can take on in people's lives without you knowing. You could make a piece of music in your bedroom. For instance, there's a song of mine called Terrorist, which has something like 5 million people have heard it seems. And it's one of those songs that when I'm on tour, people sing along at the shows. It's fantastic to sort of have that. But for me, I basically was half asleep and came up with the chorus in my bed while I was half asleep. And so it's just amazing to say, go to Australia, Sydney, or go to, Greece, and people are singing it back to you. And you're thinking, wow, this song that was just sort of in my mind at that time has this significance to a person, or for example, a person will come to you after a show and say, this song interacted with this particular thing I was going through in my life, and it meant this to me. And that's just like, wow, I couldn't ask for more in that situation. So for me, yeah, those sort of connections with people, I guess the truth is that those aspects of your identity of when you're making those songs, they are a reflection of still you, a part of you. It may not be something you choose to identify with very closely now. It may not be something that you really want to emphasize about yourself, but it's a particular stage in your life. And so I don't necessarily think there is a need to necessarily negate any of it, because there's nothing too drastic that I completely disagree with. There's things I would word completely differently, though. There's things that I just don't think sounded very good. There's things that I think should have been mixed differently. There's all types of stuff. But you're right, though. You're right. Overall, forging that bond with someone else is something money can't buy.
It's paramount.
Absolutely, it's paramount.
I think there's something very fascinating about that kind of level of openness, and it's important to also remember that you were a teenager at this mixtape time. You were a teenager still, which is when we look back to our life now, it's that's very young. Our son is just a little bit younger than you were when you were doing these things, which is really mind blowing also to me. But hip hop, as we know, it can be very. There's a lot of machismo. There's it can be very, not just competitive, but also combative. It's got this kind of energy, and especially sometimes, especially for men, there's a kind of hypermasculinity that is there. So it's really quite something that you were also able at a very young age still to show vulnerability. Because if I'm thinking about myself, I mean, I'm not particularly I wouldn't consider myself hypermasculine, but I think that I don't think that I would have had the courage.
It takes courage.
To just admit that or acknowledge that in kind of so many words.
I think I also must have felt listened to.
Yes.
When I opened up emotionally, I think you're right. It's something I've noticed in almost all of my friends. Yeah, I must have felt listened to. I must have felt. Oh, but you know what else I think also had an influence was Tupac's music.
Yes.
So Tupac's music gave me a real green light to sort of be, not mutilate my the sort of facility, the faculties of communication, of points on an emotional level of saying I feel sad, of saying I felt weak at this. I really think that was definitely one of the really good influences that his music had on me, and probably on lots of other people too. Even just sort of telling people you love them. his music it had that in it, and he was really a formative stage. Tupac's music was the soundtrack to a lot of stuff. But also for me, what I think attracted me to his music so much was the passion, because he was just so passionate in whatever he was doing. And obviously there was a little bit of a thrill of, at that age, of sort of the curse words he was using in his disses. But then in a way that sort of drew me in, but then the other stuff sort of really affected me deeply.
And that's what other kids are going to be saying about Lowkey's works. Like, I listened to Dear Listener, and this is what happened to me. It's exactly the same thing. So there's a place for it, like you've just proven, right?
I think that not to get too much into this debate, but people are always like, is it Tupac or Biggie? And for me, I have to say that while I'm sure that Biggie was a great MC, and everybody kind of probably acknowledges that. But to me, I think I agree with you. Well, I didn't necessarily talk about this comparison, but Tupac had so much passion, and wherever in the world you go, there's always going to be a graffiti of Tupac, and he's like a Bob Marley of hip hop. It's like he's like a global icon, and I think it has got a lot to do with the fact that he dared to be very human. Like in all of it, he was still very human, and there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, and it's that humanhood that people relate to, and in a way, it's funny. He was a combination of many things, but he wasn't too prideful to show all of that and bare his soul in that way. And you're right. That I in a way, I think, because I was so young when I learned some of that stuff, I don't seem to have really appreciated that. It takes strength. It takes strength to sort of be honest in that way and be clear about your weaknesses, I guess.
Yeah. And I've been wondering to myself, of course, you were just talking about how at 16 or 17 you were calling in and doing those performances and competing. But you came into hip hop quite earlier than that, maybe 12. And I asked myself, so what does a 12-year-old or anybody at that age, what is it in you that tells you that you have something to say, you would like to be heard, and you are prepared to get people to pay attention to you? I've seen 12-year-olds. We've raised them. And I just don't know. What quality in you, or what was the desire? What sparked that interest in you?
Well, I think that being the youngest of 3 children and wanting attention from people, but also I think mimicking a lot of the stuff that was coming from the United States. So, at 12, I was nowhere near making music about the kind of things that I would later on. I was literally just reproducing what I'd heard from Wu-Tang Clan, Method Man, Redman, Mos Def, basically in a sort of fake American accent, as a lot of us were here, unfortunately.
Everywhere. We were like that everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, it was, Britain in general, it's got like 105 US military bases. One of the really interesting sort of anecdotal stories I find is Daniel Immerwahr has this book, How to Hide an Empire, and he looks at the development of the Beatles. Now, I'm definitely nowhere near comparing myself to them, but what I'm saying is that what happened with them was he argues that their proximity to major US bases meant that the kind of music that the soldiers on these bases, the US soldiers on these bases, were passing around was then seeping out of the base into the localities where they lived. And so they got into US music and started mimicking the kind of music that was coming out of the United States at that time and was popular. Obviously, later on, he then, talks about John Lennon funding the Black Panthers and the IRA, and Paul McCartney at one point speaking out against nuclear weapons. And in a way, I'd kind of look at it as not a completely dissimilar process for me. We were very, very influenced by the United States, culturally particularly. And also, I think now when we have the internet, we underestimate quite the extent of how singular and across the board that influence was. It was really almost the only window that we looked into growing up, because it was just so dominant. And so an aspect of that, you know, I was in a home where, you know, we had Franz Fanon on the bookshelf, we had Public Enemy on the record player, we had Gil Scott Heron there, Sam Cooke. So I was very lucky to be exposed to, you know, these kind of things. So I was able to sort of relate to things in a slightly different kind of way. But definitely, I would say that the early stage was literally just reproducing and mimicking what I heard, what I thought was cool, what I thought would make me cool, what I thought would give me attention.
Validation.
Validation, all those kind of things. And, you know, without a doubt, going to the open mics and battling, I battled in school, I battled at the open mics, doing all that kind of stuff was still part of that bid to sort of be acknowledged, I guess, by people. But then you realize what this music can do and what you can do with it and what it can be used to do. And you sort of start to change and realize how you can use it, I would say.
It's interesting. Yes, absolutely. To me, it's interesting. Now you mentioned about, like, you were talking about the kind of home that you were growing in, and you could be like, these days they talk about this third culture kids.
Yeah,
like you are kind of like fit into that description. One of your parents is from Britain and one of them is from Iraq. Yeah. How was it? What kind of a mixture of cultures? Like how did that form the person that you became and the identity?
Well, I'd say my dad's side of the family, his father was a coal miner who started working at 11. Post World War II, Dover. Their experience was harsh, but he chose out of his family members to move to London and become part of the Socialist Workers' Party. He was involved in Rock Against Racism, and then really through student politics, he and him at the time, he was actually voted president of the student union, and then the admin of the university met with students to try and push him out. Okay. And my mum was one of the students that they met with, and she went and told him what the admin at the university were trying to do to him, because actually they'd gone into occupation about fees for foreign students. And so it's quite interesting that kind of stuff comes together. I mean, I think at that time, things became sharper with the war on terror in terms of those particular kind of identities. And I think that the challenges that me and my siblings were faced with the advent of the war on terror were sort of different to the ones that they had faced before. So, obviously, my mum had been called racist things on the street and, on trains and everything else. But it became structural and technological in a way that it didn't seem to have been in their time, though obviously my perception, the Rock Against Racism were founded because in areas like the one that I lived in, the racists were firebombing people's houses. You had 4 days of riots on the road that I lived on next to Grenfell Tower, in which houses of people from the Caribbean were being, like I say, firebombed and people were being attacked. And that's what led to Notting Hill Carnival, which is, a celebration of Caribbean culture in London. And so Rock Against Racism was part of the response to stuff like that. My dad was arrested at the Battle of Lewisham. Again, a bid to stop the National Front marching through Lewisham, this area that was full of people from the outer reaches of the British Empire. And so, in terms of the war on terror, what that sort of posed a question for us as children was, the state that you belong to is now assuming a violent posture towards people that are like you. And so that it's quite a sort of complicated position to find yourself in. Obviously, the political party that my dad was a part of is the most, and this is a fact, it's the most infiltrated by spy cops in British history. And this has been proven by the Spy Cops inquiry, which has found a huge amount of British spy cops infiltrating into that organization. And then through the infiltration of that organization, being able to spy on campaigns like the Justice for Stephen Lawrence campaign, who was murdered by racists in this country also. So you've grown up with this kind of political atmosphere, and then the war on terror happens, and you are now, in the eyes of the state, potentially far more dangerous than you would have been otherwise. Maybe you would have been a leftist, maybe you would have been, subversive in that way. But now all of a sudden, you might actually be somebody who wants to commit an act of political violence. And stuff like the prevent duty, makes it a legal duty on all public sector workers to spy on kids. It allows them to have counter-terror police question children without the presence or the knowledge of their parents. And that's under the prevent duty, which is unprecedented powers being put in the hands of the state. And so that then put us in quite a sort of difficult position, like I say, because all of us had Arabic names, first names, and the way that I think we've attempted to make sense of that in our different ways has been to try and find methods to grapple with state violence leading to mass death. So, in my sister's case, it's been more the legal route. So she's not a lawyer, but she works in law, was involved in one of the most important cases in British history where still surviving victims of the British camps in Kenya, what they call the Mau Mau camps, but obviously not everyone in the camps was Mau Mau. She was involved in that case, building that case that won compensation for those people. Obviously, there's limitations. You're talking about a £20 million payout, but then it got split in many, many ways. So basically, each person is getting about £2,000. But as a legal precedent, at least it has use in the law to later on be applied, of course. Whereas me, it was more the music kind of thing. And with music, sky can be the limit. You can reach people in all types of different ways. And I think for me also, it was potentially allowing people from similar kinds of backgrounds, which the society at that time sort of seeks to problematize and basically say, well, you don't really belong. Well, you say, well, through the music I belong, and we link arms with others who relate to those kind of experiences. But overall, for me, beyond the sort of navel gazing aspect of the identity, where you say, oh, where do I stand? That has very little use. It has very, very little use. What's actually useful is what you can organize around, what campaigns you can be a part of, what your music can serve to help, and how that can then affect the material realities. So I think that, that process, walking that process, was quite interesting and quite useful. But it's certainly a kind of an interesting position to find yourself in within this sort of historical context, without a doubt.
Yeah. I mean, to me, what you're saying resonates so strongly and so clearly, because I grew up in South Africa, apartheid South Africa in the 80s, and there was that same volatile political climate, and we were also subjected to the the racism that said you don't belong, you're wrong, and everything like that. And what I noticed is that during the all of the people from my generation became quite militant at some point. And I wonder, is that something that can be avoided if you are subjected to that in your younger years, in your formative years? You see the injustice. Does that now bring birth or give birth to the activist or indeed the extremist in a person?
I mean, I think for me, Grenfell would have been the most sort of radicalizing thing that happened in my life, because, you know, with the reaction of, by and large, the Iraqi community in this country has not been to get massively sort of politically involved, you know, particularly my generation. A lot of them saw just for them to get involved in the political process in Iraq, because they felt that coming from England, they could, you know, they could be part of it. You know, a lot of them have worked for think tanks, which sort of buttress the war machine. A lot of them have worked as sort of translators for the British Army and other things like that. So that was never the way that I wanted to go. But yeah, I mean, to sort of speak to your question, it was Grenfell that really put me to the point of no return, actually, because I think at that time in my life, there was definitely a space for me to be subsumed into academia and just work on sort of historical studies of things that have very little relevance in the here and now, you know, or limited relevance in the here and now, just sort of studying history in a kind of cold and emotionless way. But with Grenfell, you know, you're talking about, you know, a young man who I knew since he was 14 years old. He was my friend. He died in there with his family. His little brother, who was 4 years old, went to the same primary school that my son goes to. 3 generations of one family. I saw them at the window, communicating with them. You know, we went through something quite exceptional in you know, in the history of Britain. That was quite an exceptional experience to have. And then seeing the way in which the state rolled down to assure social order and made sure that the limitations on what we could do, you know, we became, essentially, it's my belief that the community were more criminalized than the companies that were involved in the refurbishment that caused all of that mass death were. And, you know, when history speaks, it will say that. It will say that when the documents become public, it will say, look, this is the extent that the British state went to calm this situation down and assure social order, avoid rioting. These are the databases of information which were collected on the people in the area. And obviously, me being a fairly well-known dissident and subversive, you know, so it intensified surveillance without a doubt, but also it was absolutely radicalizing, because at that point you're now saying, okay, well, this is not an abstract thing. You know, this is not something that other people in other places are experiencing, that I feel I have an affinity with them, that I have solidarity with them. No. This is my actual neighbors. This is the cladding is in my hair. It's on my body. I washed it off my body. Yeah. So after that, you know, there is no coming back. What in that community, what our awareness of how bad things actually can be are different from a lot of the rest of the country, because a lot of the rest of the country still doesn't really, even literally like 500 meters up the road, that literally like 500 meters up the road, people don't, you know, they have an understanding of it, but they don't have the same understanding as us who were there on the night, who saw it, who knew the people that died. It's a whole different thing, you know, and that's the point of no return, you know, because from then you can't go back to seeing the British state as a benign entity. It's just not possible.
Yeah. So just to clarify, we might have listeners or viewers in many places in the world. So Grenfell was, and you are probably you are the expert on this, but Grenfell was a sort of high-rising building, like a public housing, council house, that caught on fire because and people got stuck there, and it was a terrible tragedy. And there was a situation where some of the cladding that was used in the building was such
flammable.
that, yes.
Flammable.
Yes.
It was
So
polyethylene. Yeah, it was polyethylene. And the regulatory system had been worn down to such an extent that people can basically put whatever they want in buildings now when it comes to flammability and and basically get away with it. And so it's, you know, it's a disaster waiting to happen across the country. You've got hospitals, schools, hotels, cinemas that have the same kind of stuff on it. You have less than a mile away from Grenfell a primary school which has been built with flammable insulation made by one of the same companies that put flammable insulation on Grenfell.
and this is literally right next door to you. Like you
Yeah.
are yeah. So this is on your street. Yeah.
Yeah.
That I can imagine that is certainly something that would have a great impact. I wanted to touch a little bit about still that the side of the having the Arabic background also. Are you connected with the Arabic hip hop from the what we call Middle East or North Africa, or are you part of? Do you feel like you're part of that kind of community as well, or what kind of affinities and do you have?
Yeah, I follow it. Not very deeply. I know quite a few great artists from there. You know, I think one of the difficult things about hip hop in Arabic is in the wider society, often it is associated as quite a crude mimicking of the United States and a kind of sort of cultural colonialism, cultural imperialism. But actually, a lot of the artists do go to quite great lengths to forge a line of connection from early, even pre-Islamic Arabic poetry and hip hop. Today, they go off of, you know, people like Mutanabbi, people like Jawahari, people like Khansa, you know, these kind of poets who had real cultural impact, you know, a long time before hip hop existed, and they sort of forged that connection. So it's not just simply something that, you know, happened in the Bronx in the 80s and then came to the Middle East. A lot of these young people doing it are connecting it to the deeper history of the Arabic language. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a part of that community because, you know, my primary public language is English. I speak Arabic at home. I listen to Arabic music, but not as much as I listen to English music. I probably follow more Arabic news than I follow English news. So it's a sort of interesting position to be, but I wouldn't very clearly sort of demarcate myself as being part of that wider Arabic hip hop community, because really, you know, the people who were my peers growing up are, you know, people like Wretch 32 or Carla, and, you know, people that are very much in that space of the English language.
Absolutely, sure. And there's some interesting people also that you have been you've been working with. I mean, some people might know you, like people like Doc Brown, who since have become like a big kind of comedian, done a lot of like films and a lot of comedy in general, stand up and music based comedy, and that. And you guys were in the same group in Poisonous Poets, and where also was Reveal, who is I think he's an academic with the Iranian hip hop. I've seen some lecture online that he's talking about. So there's London is quite a place where you have very eclectic mix of people, all sorts of people doing and living in that culture that exists there.
Absolutely. I mean, London is one of those places. It's like a mosaic, and the channels of communication that people have branch all over the world. So you can very much live in an Iraqi or Moroccan or a Lebanese or an Iranian community, maybe less Iranian community here, quite effectively, you know, handling most of your business in other languages. So it's beautiful and great in that way. And yeah, Poisonous Poets, you know, the ironic thing, obviously, about the connection with Poisonous Poets is when I first came to the open mic, Doc Brown hosted the open mic, and he said to me, the other Lowkey, that's someone else's name, he's here. And so I just go up in the open mic and start rapping and saying my name's Lowkey. And then the other guy comes in and Doc Brown says, oh yeah, this is the real Lowkey. At which point I, being the obnoxious young boy that I was, said, okay, let's battle for the name. And this poor guy is just going about his business doing his night, and we battle, I win, and then from then on I use the name. And then Doc Brown actually asked me to join Poisonous Poets, or brought me to meet Reveal, and through Reveal joined Poisonous Poets. And yeah, I mean, what an amazing collective of artists Poisonous Poets are and were.
The UK music, I think now, since that it has kind of like the black music, the garage, the what became grime and all that stuff, it has become quite well known globally, and you have like now this artist like Stormzy and whoever else. But at the time, like, this is a very recent development. At the time that we are talking about here, that was still kind of like on the come up. That hadn't yet happened. How much has the UK kind of like the music scene that where you find yourself in, how much has that changed even during your musical career?
Oh, I mean, massively. This time that we're talking about the Choice FM, the Deal Real, the Hip Hop Connection, it was probably in tens of thousands maximum, pardon me, of people that would know any of this stuff was happening. Then when the internet, from MySpace to Facebook to YouTube, came into it, the ability to reach possibly millions of people kind of opened up. And I could never, at that point, I could never have dreamed of making a song like Terrorist or Long Live Palestine or Abomination, and these songs being heard by millions of people around the world, especially without any involvement from any major record company. It's just a dream come true, and much less to be able to tour these songs and people know the songs, such a blessing.
I'd like to ask, in terms of what you've just said, this being able to reach millions of people, doesn't that place a huge responsibility on you as an artist? And how do you relate to that? Do you feel like you do have a responsibility to the people you are connecting to or speaking to, influencing?
Well, I think now the only place that I have any hope really of reaching millions of people now, because of the algorithms, is Twitter. So I can put out tweets that will have, in terms of impressions, maybe 1 million, 2 million. YouTube is just not distributing my music to that extent now. Spotify, there's space. Absolutely. I'm not denying there's space, but it's still limited in terms of those numbers. Instagram, you can kind of get okay kind of levels of interaction. Facebook is just a non-starter for me now. So I do, to some extent, think there is a responsibility. If that many people are listening to you, you don't want to be putting ideas in their head which are harmful to them, but also you want to be putting stuff into their consciousness which is of use and of interest to them. You want to give them stuff that you feel they need to know.
Value adding stuff. Yes.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I guess, I mean, and this is maybe these are not really so different things because you're one person, but perhaps initially you were like you were artist X amount of percentage of artist and then activist of another. How much has that kind of relation changed in from your younger years? Because now it feels like the activism is quite a big part. You have your podcast, you do a lot of stuff, and you're a very sort of important political commentator in UK and beyond in a lot of this kind of topics and subject matters. But how do you see, like, at what degree are you artist? Pardon?
I delineate those things. I mean, yeah. I would say probably I'm more a journalist now than I am other things. I mean, I tour quite a lot in the year, which is great, but mainly that's off the music that had that level of audibility 10 years ago, where you were able to get an album released independently, 33 in the midweek charts. That was completely unheard of then. For independent hip hop, you had literally one or two signed hip hop artists charting at that time. And so that album has allowed me to be able to tour in the way that I do. And that's great. And I love that. and I enjoy that massively. But I do feel that that kind of algorithmic limitation, which is put on the music now, means that you kind of have to start thinking about potentially new business models in terms of getting your music out there. You know, you could, for example, one could start a Patreon at which they have even 2,000 listeners. But if those 2,000 listeners, you're putting out a couple songs a month, are paying a certain amount of money every month, then you have a more kind of reliable, and, you know, basically, I guess the lesson of sort of my experience with the music and these times has been constant adaptation to the circumstances, to continue doing what you want to do, to continue making a living, which allows you to do what you want to do. And so that is, you know, really been the story of how things are. And you know, the model of being able to throw your music at millions and then thousands buying it is very much the major label model. And that's, you know, how you had, you know, the YouTube thing. And now they're able to sort of inundate their YouTube videos with millions of views, which then leads to revenue from the advertising. So basically, you know, you're a conduit for me selling your information to Coca-Cola, so Coca-Cola can better advertise to you, and then Coca-Cola pays me, basically. You know, back then, 10 years ago, we were selling, like you said, the CD in someone's hand, or we were selling it through iTunes where the person was paying for the download. We weren't selling your information to another company. Whereas now that's basically the way it functions through YouTube and through Spotify, unfortunately. It's data mining. You know, I'm facilitating, I'm a conduit of that data mining process now. So yeah, I think it's about being inventive in new ways that you can kind of make a living off of this now. And, you know, I've been fortunate and privileged to be at that particular part of the sort of story of how the music industry has developed.
It's really remarkable, like when you think about, like, from those, you know, CDRs or whatever, you know, like you have your mixtapes and you press them, and then you're selling them, and then from MySpace and YouTube, and then all of a sudden, like, algorithms, and it, like, really everything has changed during your career, which is not like you're not like you're not old, you know, as in your 70s. This is not like, this is still like a limited amount of time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I wanted to ask before, because I'm looking at the time and I realize that we could talk forever, and we don't have forever. There's only so much attention span people are willing to give to something. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the hiatus you took to go off the scene. What inspired that, and where did you go?
Well, I think I wasn't completely ready actually for the at that time, the level of, you know, on modest success that I had. I wasn't really ready for it. And what I wanted to do was have the time to study properly, to, you know, so I got a qualification as an English teacher. I got a qualification as a personal trainer. I worked as a translator in Calais on 3 successful cases in bringing people to the UK under the Dubs Amendment of EU law when Britain were part of the EU. And that was good. I spent a long time in Palestine also. But then I sort of came to the conclusion that, look, these are things you feel passionate about. You're seeing, you know, in the people that you're teaching and in the people that you're working alongside, and you're seeing these problems. You can only reach a certain amount of people in day-to-day communication, you know, in the sort of tens or hundreds at best. You have this platform as a sort of character, which is Lowkey. You don't even understand what you have, and you need to take advantage of that. And so that's when I sort of made the decision to make the song Ahmed, you know. And one of the sort of parts of that is I was working a lot on the stuff with people seeking refuge in England, and one of the things that I went to was a demonstration in Dover against the major anti-migrant push happening there. And of course, as I said, Dover is a place where a lot of the English side of my family are from. But the level of, you know, racism that I saw and speaking to some local people about the situation, I thought, wow, you know, the same kind of time of that we were seeing, as we have seen since, and as we saw before then, you know, people drowning in the Mediterranean, people washing up on the beaches, and I thought, how can I reach people and try to fight back against this? And the best way that I could was to make the song Ahmed, and at that time we did it, and it was, you know, we were fortunate in terms of the algorithms, because, you know, it reached a lot of people, and so yeah, so that was what kind of pushed me to come back. I mean, also I got a master's in Middle Eastern studies as well during that period. Was, you know, I was very busy during the period, and I was also thinking of music, but after that I started to see the cultural function of my music, rather than just seeing it as something all about me. I saw it as actually about the sort of collective and the society, and how I can sort of play a role in society.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That's really amazing. We've been like I was saying earlier. I mean, I've been listening to music for a long time, almost as long as it has been available, wow. and you know, you came in during the Dear Listener time, and so it has been a meaningful, it has been really meaningful music in many ways, because your music is very meaningful, and it has a lot of substance.
We've been playing your music for so long on PEPR, so for us it's like this day was always going to happen. It was always going to come, and there would not be enough time to cover all the questions that we'd like to ask, but we hope that we're going to get a chance another time to speak to you.
Absolutely, it'd be brilliant.
It's been so great to have you here. Thank you
so much both. Really appreciate it.